Time for another World Heritage Wednesday, and today I am in Canterbury and we're looking at Canterbury Cathedral, St Augustine's Abbey and the fantastic little St Martin's Church. Added to the UNESCO World Heritage List in 1988, there are three elements to this site: Canterbury Cathedral, St Augustine's Abbey and St Martin's Church. Now the story of this site all starts in the early 5th century. As the Western Roman Empire falls apart, the legions leave Britain to its own devices. And it would appear that this section of St Martin's Church is from that era. Shortly after the Romans leave, the Anglo-Saxons start migrating over to Britain, taking over much of what is now England and establishing several kingdoms on the island. Now late Roman Britain had been largely Christian, but the Anglo-Saxons followed a Germanic version of paganism and rather quickly pushed Christianity out of their territory. Christianity in the British Isles did survive in a Celtic form in Wales, Cornwall, southern Scotland and especially in Ireland. Things started to change in the late 6th century. Bertha, daughter of Cerbert I, the Merovingian king of Paris, was married to Ethelbert, king of Kent. She was Christian, Ethelbert was pagan, but she was allowed as part of her marriage agreement to continue practicing her Christianity freely. She restored the old Roman church, that's now St Martin's, to give her a small place to worship. Now what happens next is a little unclear. Either A, Bertha persuaded Ethelbert to send a request to Rome for Christian missionaries. B, Bertha and the Kentish court asked Rome with Ethelbert's permission. Or C, Pope Gregory initiated the mission as part of his wider goal of establishing papal supremacy throughout Christian Europe. And one thing I find very interesting of note is that the Christians of Kent looked towards Rome and European Christianity rather than towards Ireland and Celtic Christianity. Now a lot of this might have had something to do with the fact that Bertha was from what is now northern France. Her father was king of Paris and therefore would have been part of the Roman Catholic tradition in Europe rather than the Celtic Christianity centred around Ireland. So whatever the reason behind the request, this is where our main character Augustine comes into play. In 595 the Benedictine monk was chosen to lead the mission to Christianise Britain. Now Augustine and about 40 companions were sent to Kent, but at some point whilst they were travelling through Gaul, they had a change of heart and Augustine went back to Rome to ask the Pope's permission to return. Gregory, however, had different ideas and said, nope, you're going to England. And in 597 they arrived in Kent and used the small church at St Martin's to begin to preach to the local people. It didn't take long before they'd converted Ethelbert, who gave them land both in and outside the city Canterbury for the monks to build religious structures. Outside the city walls, Augustine founded the monasteries of St Peter and St Paul, St Mary's and St Pancreas. These would later combine to form what would become St Augustine's Abbey. Inside the city, Augustine established the chair of the Archbishopric, in Latin cathedral, from which to govern Kent's Christian conversion. The current Archbishop of Canterbury, the Most Reverend Justin Welby, is 105th in line of succession from Augustine, which makes the Archbishopric of Canterbury the oldest surviving institution in the English-speaking world, older than the Crown, older than even the Kingdom of England. Canterbury Cathedral is undergoing some restoration work, but it's still a fantastic example of Romanesque and early Gothic architecture. The current cathedral was rebuilt in 1070 to 1077 by the order of Archbishop Lefranc after the Norman conquest of 1066. Now it was a common thing that once the Normans had conquered England, they started to rebuild a lot of the old Saxon buildings, particularly the churches, to follow their Romanesque style of architecture that they favoured. A particular note within Canterbury Cathedral are the stained glass windows, which is some of the earliest and richest collection of stained glass anywhere within England, and some of them are just absolutely fantastic windows. a lot of effort, and you could just admire the skill and the artistry that went into producing these windows. And a time when most people lived in small wooden huts. You can imagine the kind of impression that this kind of building and these kind of colours and windows made to them. There's also the ceiling of the chapter house, which is quite frankly stunning. I absolutely love this. It's one of my favourite parts of the cathedral. And for myself, I also found it rather interesting that you can actually find, if you look closely at the stonework, plenty of fossils from the limestone and the sandstone that was used to make the cathedral. Now, by the 12th century, Canterbury had become a major pilgrimage site, and this was further enhanced in 1170 when the then Archbishop Thomas Becket and King Henry II had a falling out. The argument resulted in the Archbishop being a little bit dead. It didn't take long before miracles started happening at the place of his martyrdom, and Canterbury Cathedral became a chief pilgrimage site in England and one of the most significant sites in Europe. In 1540, in his break from the Church in Rome, another Henry dissolved the monasteries but maintained Canterbury Cathedral as the seat of the Church of England. There was some minor damage inflicted by the Puritans during the Civil War of the 1660s, along with some bombing damage during the Second World War, but other than that, the cathedral itself has stayed largely intact and is a fantastic example of 11th and 12th century art and architecture. The same, however, can't be said for St. Augustine's Abbey, which is now just a ruin. With the dissolution of the monasteries, St. Augustine's was abandoned and the monks were forced to leave, given a small pension to live off. The site was then later robbed for stone and subsequently become the ruin that you see today. The ruins are mostly from the 11th and 12th century as part of the Norman rebuilds, and under what became the nave of the Abbey is St. Augustine's Church of St. Peter and St. Paul, where the Normans built their crypt and presbytery. Once stood the Anglo-Saxon Church of St. Mary. Between the two are the foundations of Wulfric's Rotunda. The Anglo-Saxon Abbot Wulfric had this great idea of creating a larger structure by building an octagonal rotunda to connect the two churches, similar to something like Charlemagne's octagon in Aachen Cathedral. Building the rotunda required the demolition of part of St. Mary's, which must have angered her a little bit, as Wulfric soon got the sniffles and died in 1061, leaving it unfinished. His successors, not wanting to be stricken with deadness, decided to leave the project unfinished. Not that this seems to have bothered the Normans all that much, as they did a rebuild in the 1070s, just like they did at Canterbury Cathedral. Now, there is one surviving piece of Anglo-Saxon masonry at the site, and that's the ruins of St. Pancreas Church at the east end. Now, this is largely because it wasn't connected to the main abbey as a whole, but it was still one of the buildings on the site, and so the Normans just left it as it was. Now, obviously St. Augustine's is a ruin, like so many other abbeys and monasteries in Britain. So why is this one so important, and why did it make it onto the UNESCO World Heritage List? Well, besides being one of the earliest abbeys in England, it at one point had the largest collection of books and manuscripts in medieval England. Book production started in the Anglo-Saxon period and continued right the way through the Middle Ages. And at the height, the library had over 1900 volumes, and its scriptorium produced books for much of Britain and parts of Northern Europe, making it one of the leading centres of book production in the early medieval period in England. Now, sadly, we only have about 300 surviving manuscripts from this era, most of them having been lost to time. This brings us to my favourite part of this UNESCO World Heritage Site, and that's the Church of St. Martin's. It's the humblest of the three of the buildings, part Roman and part Anglo-Saxon at its core, with a few later medieval additions. And St. Martin's is still used as a church today, making it the oldest church in use in England, and one of the oldest churches still in use anywhere in the world. Parts of this building are 1500 years old. It's from this location that the Christenisation of England began, and England came under the influence of the Roman Catholic Church. It marked the beginning of the end of the Anglo-Saxon pagan world, and also marked the beginning of the end of Celtic Christianity within the British Isles. And for these reasons, along with the outstanding architecture and the religious significance being the seat of the Church of England, and with it being one of the major book production facilities within the medieval world, that this site was added to the UNESCO World Heritage List in 1988.